Welcome, everyone. Thanks, Emily, for your support throughout the past several weeks. It is my deep pleasure, great pleasure to welcome Dean Mauro Guillen to the room virtually. I'm so enjoying your book, I have to say, but let me do a proper introduction. Of course, my screen is gone, and I had it all ready to go. Yes, the newly appointed Dean at Cambridge Judge Business School. He's a keynote speaker, as you can see today, and a former Zaman Professor of International Management at the Wharton School, former Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellow, author of 10 books and over 40 scholarly articles. He appears frequently on NPR, Bloomberg TV, China News, CNN Espanol, and other broadcast media, author of a monthly op-ed column for the Korean Times, and of course, consulting engagements and collaborations in corporations around the world, Accenture, PricewaterhouseCoopers, RAND, AFL lectures, the list goes on. That's not gonna cover all of his accomplishments. I emailed Mauro and I was shocked by his grace. Honestly, who am I? And I emailed him and he said, of course, I would like to talk to you about your project. And then after he heard about it, he said, of course, I would love to talk about my book. And then I said, if I buy your books, will you sign them? And he said, of course, I would be happy to come to your house and sign 80 books. He signed 80 books for us, everybody, which is amazing. I just thought, wow, what a nice guy who teaches at Wharton. And then I watched over the summer as he shot to the top of bestseller lists and became a dean at Cambridge. And I thought, wow, that was really a lucky email that I sent. So lesson for the entrepreneurs and innovators out there, you can't lose anything by emailing that superstar that you're talking at. Just send the email and the worst that could happen is nothing. But sometimes great things happen. So thank you, Mauro. I'll kick it over to you. I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. And I hope that you can hear me okay. Let me know if that is not the case. And look, it's funny that you mentioned that I always say yes, because I'm sure you know that actually the job of the dean is oftentimes to say no to many requests, especially those coming from faculty and students. So I'm very happy to do this. And the reason is very simple, which is I'm from Spain originally. I think you can tell that I have an accent, but I've lived in Philadelphia for 25 years. Both of my daughters were born in the city and they grew up in the city. And my wife and I have, enjoyed these 25 years, very, very much. And we feel very much into that because Philadelphia has so much to especially to a young couple like we were 25 years ago. And, the city really is a wonderful place in which to come and live and work and have fun and also raise a family. And so if any, association that like yours or organization that is trying to essentially make Philadelphia even more competitive, even a far better place than it already is, I think, it is my duty to essentially, do whatever I'm asked to do. And it is certainly a pleasure for me today to spend about 15 minutes, I think, and we agreed so that it fits into your program about, what the future may bring and how a city such as ours and the companies that operate in the city and the workers and the employees who live in the city, work for these companies, how we should be preparing for what's coming. Because I believe that what's coming the next 10 years is a fundamental transformation of pretty much everything in the world. And let me explain why. Well, first of all, because we are now in the next few years going to see the full effects of some demographic changes that have been going on around the world, but certainly here in the United States and in Philadelphia for the last 50 years or so. And those changes essentially have to do with two very basic things. One is that the number of babies continues to drop, as you know, and that is mainly driven by the access that women now have in many parts of the world to education, which essentially means that then they have opportunities available to them that their mothers or their grandmothers couldn't even dream about. And the fact that now more and more women in more and more different parts of the world, graduate from high school, half of them go to then college, and then they pursue a career, essentially means that they postpone having their first baby. And as they postpone having their first baby, on average in the United States to age 28 or 29, then obviously the number of babies drops and drops. So that's one very important change, because it will have a large impact on the size of the younger age cohorts entering school, but it also has a large impact in terms of the importance in the future of the population above age 60 or so. And I'm going to return to that in a moment. The other big change from a demographic point of view is life expectancy. So the number of years that on average we live. And as you know, the good news is that those of us now in this virtual room will probably live on average about 5 or 6 years longer than our parents, and up to perhaps 11 years longer than our grandparents. And that makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference. When you put together these two changes, of course, we see that they are taking place at different rates and speeds in different parts of the world. But specifically thinking about the United States, thinking about Philadelphia, these changes have been going on for a while. And what it means is essentially that every year that passes, the number of young people entering school is smaller and smaller. And the number, as I said earlier, of people above the age of 60, 70, 80 gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So consumer markets will change as a result of that. Financial markets will change because the makeup of the population is going to change quite quickly. Now, the other big change, and it's something that I think is being felt in Philadelphia, but more importantly, is being felt nationally in the United States, and of course in a few other countries around the world as well, is the impact that minority populations, what we call minority populations, and immigration is having. And as you know, minority groups and immigrants tend to have bigger families. They tend to have more children. And therefore, for the United States as a whole, something very important that is going to happen between now and the year 2030. By the year 2030, more than half of young people in the United States below the age of 35 are going to be what today we call minority groups. So Latinx, African Americans, Asian Americans, and so on. And that's really important, right? Because look, and this is of course particularly the case in Philadelphia, which is a city that is far more diverse from an ethnic and a racial point of view than the United States as a whole, as a country. And this is important for the following reason, which is, let me just give you 4 facts here. One is that members of these groups tend to marry at an earlier age on average. Number 2 is that adjusting for purchasing power, they're more likely to purchase a home, to purchase a car, and also to use digital platforms. Once again, adjusting for purchasing power. So in other words, to the extent that we have a more diverse population, and that's particularly the case, of course, in the greater Philadelphia area, but it is increasingly the case as well in the United States as a whole, we're going to see fundamental changes that are going to, in turn, have implications for markets, I think for society, for politics, for all sorts of things. So that's on the demographic front. On the second type of trend that I want to bring to your attention is of an economic nature. And, we can talk about many different kinds of economic trends that are going on in the world, but I think the most fundamental one is that within the next 10 years or so, the United States will no longer be the largest consumer market in the world. China will become the largest market. And shortly thereafter, maybe 20 years from now, India will become the biggest consumer market in the world. And the reason why India will become bigger than China as a consumer market, not as an economy, but as a consumer market, is essentially that, in India, you have now more babies, and therefore they have a younger population, and therefore consumption is going to be higher in India than it will be in China in about 20 years from now. So what is the implication of this for people living in Philadelphia? Well, the global market and the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting away from Europe and North America, meaning from the Atlantic, towards Asia. And this is going to have important implications, I think. It's going to have important implications because we're going to have to pay more attention to those markets. And whether we want it or not, companies and brands are going to start paying more attention to them. You see, for the last 100 years or so, every important product, everything that we have in our home was designed, was launched by a company with the American or perhaps the European, but mostly the American consumer in mind. And that's about to change, right? I mean, this has been a constant for 100 years, but it's now about to change, that the Asian consumer is going to become more important. So we need to get ready for that as well. We need to realize that things are changing and that the center of attention in the global economy is shifting towards that part of the world. And then the third thing is technology. And there's nothing I can say that I think will probably add to your sense that we are increasingly using technology, that the pandemic has only accelerated that trend. Out of necessity, we're now using technology for working, for studying, for meetings like this one, for learning, as well as for entertaining ourselves and for shopping, of course. So technology is going to change a lot of things, but let me just illustrate how all of these trends will converge to produce a very different situation. And that's the whole point of the book that Anne mentioned, right? The point of the book is not to examine trends individually or in isolation, but rather to think about how they come together. So it's really important then to connect the dots across those trends. It's very important to, as I argue in the book, to think laterally. So let me offer you two examples of this. The first example is, or has to do with the way in which for the last 150 years or so, we have organized our lives, which is according to a sequential model. So when we were very little, we would just play. And then we would go to school for about 10 years or 15 years, maybe 20 years, depending on the degrees that we were pursuing. Then after that, we would work for maybe 30 years or 40 years. And then finally, we would go into retirement. So that's the way in which for the last 150 years, beginning in Europe, then in the United States, in other parts of the world, we have been organizing our lives. But now things are changing, right? And I want you to consider three trends and to think about how they come together to produce I think a phenomenal transformation in this respect. So the first trend is, as I mentioned earlier, that we're living longer. So a 60-year-old in the United States today can expect to live on average another 24 years. Now, 24 years beyond age 60, that's another lifetime. So today, as we speak, there's about 12,000 people in the United States celebrating their 60th birthday. And once again, on average, they can expect to live another 24 years. That's the first trend that I want you to consider. The second one is that not only we're living longer, but we're also staying in good physical and mental shape for a greater number of years. So in other words, somebody today who celebrates his or her or their 60th birthday is in much better shape physically and mentally on average than somebody who celebrated that same birthday 20 or 50 years ago. Okay, so this is also really important. So not only the lifespan has increased, but also the so-called health span has increased. Okay, and then the third important change that I want you to consider in conjunction with the other two is that one of the most important and unfortunately negative effects of technological change is that it makes knowledge obsolete or antiquated much faster than in the past. So if you put all of those things together, then this is my forecast as to what we're going to see happening over the next 10 years in Philadelphia, in the United States, and in many other parts of the world, which is that people are going to go back to school several times. Now, why do I say that? Well, people are going to first go to school in their teenage years, and then maybe go to college, and then they will work. And by the time they are 40 years old, they will realize that much of what they learned at school 20 years earlier has become obsolete because of technological change. And so they will decide to go back to school to remain competitive in the labor market. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that people will go back and check into a dorm at a college campus, not necessarily. What I'm saying is that people will go back to learn full time for a year or for two, maybe using a digital platform, such as the one that we're using now. And then they will work for another 20 years. And when they celebrate their 60th birthday, they're going to realize two things. First is that they still have another 24 years ahead of them on average. And that's an awfully long time. And that maybe they haven't been able to save enough for 24 years worth of retirement. And the second thing that they will realize is that all of that they learned when they went back to school at age 40, perhaps much of it has become obsolete yet again. So I think that at age 60 or around age 60, a lot of people will go back to school again, right? Now, here's an even bolder scenario for us to consider. If people go back to school full-time several times, not just once during their lifetime, then there's nothing preventing them from pursuing a different profession, a different occupation, a different career each time that they go back to school. Look, this is already happening, but it's only about 1% or maybe 2% of the American population that is doing this, going back to school every 20 years or so. It's still a very small percentage of people. But I think in the next few years, we're going to see a dramatic increase in that, especially because of technological change. Okay, so that's one scenario, one thing that I want you to consider. And maybe, Anne, if we have time for Q&A, maybe we can discuss that further. Now, why is that thinking about that important? I think it's very important to think about that because it's not just individuals who need to adjust to that new way of organizing our lives. It's also companies, organizations, the government. And I also believe that cities like Philadelphia will also need to take that into account because that's going to change not just the experience of people and how they live their lives. I think it's going to fundamentally transform the economy if we actually shift towards that other way of organizing our lives. So that's the first example that I wanted to show you. The second example involves, what else? Remote work. So many of us, not all of us, but many of us, about 50% of the American workforce, has experienced remote work over the last 18 months. And it's been a big experiment. I think both individuals and companies have learned over the last 18 months about the advantages and also the disadvantages of remote work. And I personally believe, based on the evidence so far, that in the near future, we are going to be somewhere in between. I think what we're going to see is hybrid work arrangements, blended work arrangements that combine work at the office with work from home. But if that happens, there's also the possibility that some employees of companies will still be 100% remote. And if that's the case, then there's nothing preventing companies from hiring workers all over the world without asking them to move. So in other words, you could see a situation in which a company, let's say in Singapore, looks for another marketing expert for their team, and they advertise and they find the ideal candidate in Philadelphia. And they tell that person, look, you don't have to move to Singapore. You can work for our company, but on a remote basis. Okay? So I think as a result of this, what we may see for the first time in history is a truly global market for talent emerging in the world. And this is going to have some, really positive consequences, but also some negative ones. I think companies, for the most part, will benefit from this because they will have access to a larger pool of talent. I think a large proportion of workers will also benefit. Those would be workers who have differentiated skills that are very valuable, that companies all over the world will be searching for. But there's also going to be a lot of workers who lack those differentiated skills, and they're going to be displaced by this trend because companies may find somebody to replace them who can work on a remote basis, who has the same skills or even better skills, but is willing to work for a lower wage. So we need to prepare for this. I think Philadelphia needs to prepare for this. by doing two things. First is making sure that nobody's left behind. We need to make sure that the human resources that we have in the city are prepared for this new technological wave that is coming. We need to redouble our efforts at training and providing opportunities for professional growth and occupational growth. But there's another thing that I think a city like Philadelphia, which I mentioned at the beginning, I think is a very livable place. It's a very attractive place in which to live, which is to try to persuade people to come and live in the city or in its greater metro area and work remotely from here. Why not? I mean, the city has a lot to offer in terms of entertainment, great schools, wonderful, parks and great housing stock, proximity to both New York and Washington, but at a much lower cost of living. So there's many things going in favor of Philadelphia. We should have as a city a strategy for attracting remote workers who would like to, start a family here in the city. And at the same time, work for a company or an organization that is located somewhere else in the United States or somewhere else in the world. Unless we prepare for that, I think other locations will essentially take advantage. Look, my overall message is, I think, relatively straightforward, right? I think over the next 10 years, we're going to see so to speak, the culmination of a lot of changes. I mean, some of these changes have been going on for 50 years or more. But I think it's only going to be in the next 10 years or so that we're going to see with our own eyes the full implications of this. Because we're going through a great transformation, driven, as I said, by the combination of three very different kinds of trends that are mutually reinforcing each other. So population trends, economic trends, and technological trends. And unless we first examine how they're going to change the situation in combination, those three trends, and then we come up with some, strategy for dealing with those changes, I think it's going to be very difficult to adapt. And I think that strategy needs to be developed by individuals, by families, by communities, by companies and organizations, and in addition, by cities, of course, by countries as well. So that was the message that I wanted to convey to you today. And thank you once again so much for inviting me to say a few words at your gathering here. And back to you, Anne. And again, as you know, I will never say no.
Somebody would stay for a few questions. Is Rebecca? I thought my mic. Yes, my mic is on. Mauro, can you hear me? Are you still able to stick around?
I can hear you.
Questions? Okay, great. I just had one question about the three trends, and I loved your book, I want to say, and I was really happy to see that it was very, the chapter about the cities being on the front lines of both the wealth gap and climate change that sort of complicate the management of these trends. I wanted you to talk a little bit about, based on your perch, perhaps there's some cities that are managing this or talking about this globally, some metro areas that are already thinking about the humanity of the transformation we're about to go through, both on the demographics, whether they're managing their aging population well or attracting diversity the way that Philadelphia has, we've done that in the past. Or managing the technological changes. Are there any metro areas in your studies that you could talk about that are at the forefront of managing a response?
Well, I believe that probably the best example in the United States is one that I write about in the book, which is Chattanooga, Tennessee. So this is a city much smaller than Philadelphia, but still a city that used to be a big manufacturing hub. And like, other cities that once had a vibrant manufacturing industry, they started to decline in the 1960s and the 1970s. And they essentially decided to do three things, I think. One was to very quickly try to, turn the downtown area into a vibrant park and city. Now, we already have that in Philadelphia, right? We don't need to do that. We already have a vibrant downtown. I mean, what we need is perhaps to spread the wealth through the other areas or parts of the city. But the second thing that they did was they set up for free for every company, for every individual, a really high-speed internet service in the city, okay? And so much so that you can't imagine how many startups decided to set up shop in Chattanooga, Tennessee, to take advantage of that big, infrastructure project there, right? And then the third thing that they did was to encourage immigration from the United States and from abroad, right? Talent, right? People who would be willing to work and work hard and take advantage of the city. And it is, over the last 20 years or so, one of the fastest growing cities in terms of economic activity, or metro areas in terms of economic activity in the United States. So I would point that to that example. There are several others in the book. I think, in other words, there is hope. I mean, it is possible in the United States to make a city come back, return to prosperity. It is certainly possible.
Thank you. I wanted to open the room for questions and open the chat if there's any questions in the chat, or if there's any questions for Mauro in the room. Sir in the purple, I can't read your name, I'm sorry.
Yes. Thank you. Mauro, thank you for the presentation, and I'll make sure to pick up a copy of the book. Very interested. One question is about transportation, getting these people from place to place. You mentioned also environment, but also in Philadelphia, you have a large population of poverty. And how do you address that while bringing new people into the city and deal with the conflict of getting those people to work also? And the other thing you mentioned was as somebody going to college, a lot of those folks in poverty aren't getting to college, so they're not getting to 40 to getting to college again, or to 60 and thinking they need more continuing education. So what do we do with that population and help them in that process?
Thanks for your question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, above everything else, you have to avoid gentrification, right? You have to avoid this duality that sometimes emerges between people who are coming in with high levels of education, they have good jobs, and then the locals who lost their jobs and they don't have as much education and they're finding it very difficult to escape the cycle of poverty. So I think it's really important to have a strategy for attracting companies that will create jobs that are both high skill and medium skill or low skill, right? I think it's extremely important to keep that in mind, because if you only bring in jobs or companies that create jobs that are highly paying for highly educated workers and all of that, then as you say, inevitably, you're going to create two classes of residents in the city. And that's not good. That's not good for so many reasons. And in a way, that's what I think has happened in some parts of Philadelphia, right? I mean, Philadelphia, we have some of the highest paid jobs and occupations in the country. And at the same time, we have so many other people who struggle to even find a job at a very low wage. So that's also something that has to be part of the strategy. And again, I hope that we don't make the mistake in the next 10 years that we made in the last 20 years, which is to leave people behind, right? Because then you know what happens. What happens is that poverty increases, social problems increase, and most importantly, also political polarization increases, right? People start getting desperate and they start voting for, fringe candidates and so on and so forth. We've seen that both in Europe and the United States, and I think it's something really important to avoid in the future.
Thank you, Mauro. I don't want to neglect Zoom lands, so let's take one last question from the chat. I apologize to everyone in the group who still have questions, but we're on a timeline, and I don't want to neglect the virtual crowd. So Emily, did you pick one from the chat for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a question of this tomorrow. How important do you think education will be in the truly global economy, and who do you think is leading that competition?
Yeah, I want to add to that question. You know, I'm curious what you think coming from the university, how vulnerable traditional education institutions are to this. I agree people are going to have lifelong learning. I'm not sure where they'll go for that. And I'm curious your thoughts. And I you know, coming from.
No, I think education is really important because we are in a knowledge economy and we will be for a very long time to come. But I don't think education should be confused with college or university, right? You know, my feeling is that in Philadelphia, after having lived there for 25 years, some of the most pressing needs are actually in primary and secondary education, right? I mean, we've forgotten a little bit about those levels of education. And we have made, of course, great investments in higher education in the city, and the universities are doing really, really well. Penn, Temple, Drexel, and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, the economy needs people with different kinds of skills and different kinds of education. And as you said, it's really important also to offer lifelong learning and educational opportunities, not just for the most highly skilled people, but for everyone, right? Really, really, really important to do that. And by the way, if I may, there's also a question in the chat about the wage tax, right? Which I guess we all pay in the city. And look, I think it is important for a city like Philadelphia to raise revenue in order to essentially provide services. And, you know, the debate, I think, should be not so much about whether we need a wage tax or not, but what should be the level of that wage tax, right? What percentage? And how we can lower it over the long run, assuming that we only lower it if the economy gets bigger and therefore the tax base also gets bigger, right? And you can still get that revenue to cover social services, to pay for education in the city, in public schools, and so on and so forth. So I think the question is not so much whether you want to get rid of it or not, but rather what is the appropriate level and how should that change over time as the economy hopefully gets better. So in other words, the tax base gets bigger.
Thank you so much, Mauro. Let's give Mauro a big round of applause. Thank you so much. So, I don't know who to speak to, like, look at you. It's the hybrid skill set developing here, emerging skill. Thank you, Mauro, so much.
Thank you for having me, Anne.
Yeah, best of luck at Cambridge. Keep in touch.
Thank you. And invite me again and I'll say yes, okay?
I'll see you at Fiddler Square.